On February 22, 2019, just after Friday prayers, hundreds of thousands of Algerians marched the streets of cities such as Algiers, Oran, Constantine, and Annaba. They were contesting a man, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, and the governing system he incarnates, which fetches its legitimacy in the independence struggle and the termination of the country's decade-long civil war in the 90s. The Hirak, which loosely translates to movement in Arabic, has been a popular movement marked by weekly marches every Friday contesting the regime. The movement is consistent, peaceful, multi-class, and the participation of women is crucial. But more importantly, it has achieved something, the fall of Bouteflika and his numerous allies. But to understand why the Hirak came to be, we have to go back in time a little to 1962, when Algeria gained its independence. The French colonized Algeria for 132 years. In 1962, the Evian Accords were signed, putting an end to an almost decade-long independence war, punctuated by extreme violence and widespread use of torture by the French army. Algeria was now independent. However, its leadership was far from unified. The FLN, the Revolutionary Party, and the ALN, its armed branch, disagreed on the direction the country should take. The de facto first premier of Algeria, Ben Youssef bin Khedda, was pushed aside by Ahmed bin Bella, supported by Army General Colonel Boumediene. On September 20, 1962, Ben Bella became Algeria's first president, with Boumediene as his In June 1965, Boumediene took control of the country in a bloodless coup overthrowing Ben Bella. Ben Bella and Boumediene had something in common. They had the same Minister of Foreign Affairs, a man named Abdelaziz Bouteflika. Bouteflika rose to prominence on the international scene by navigating his country's entry into the diplomatic world by presenting it as defender of third world interest, and participating in non-aligned movement, a group of countries that chose neither the US's nor the Soviet side during the Cold War. Bouteflika gained a reputation as a brilliant diplomat, but his rise would soon be stopped. When Colonel Boumediene died in 1979, the Algerian leadership, fearing a power vacuum, installed the highest-ranked military general, Chadli Benjedid, in power. He would rule the country from 1979 to 1992. In the meantime, Bouteflika had been accused of fraud, which led him to leave the country and live in exile from 1981 to 1987. We will now talk about Algeria's most painful memory of recent history, the 1990s Civil War. Everything starts in 1986. A drop in oil prices, which made up 98% of the country's exports, led to severe economic difficulties. Leaders from Muslim groups provided social services to the population, which greatly increased their popularity. At the beginning of the 1990s, progressive elements within the FLN, such as Mouloud Hamrouche, started pushing for a multi-party democracy system. Hamrouche believed that the coalition between FLN and the FFS, Algeria could counter the Islamist growing political cloud and take a more progressive route. However, he had underestimated the Islamist popularity. In 1991, in the country's first round of its legislative elections, the Islamic Party, known as the FIS, almost gained an absolute majority in parliament. The Algerian army under General Nizar pushed President Benjedid to cancel the second round of elections, fearing the FIS program, which included installing religious law throughout the country. This essentially blocked the FIS from getting into power. The move created what we now know as La Décennie Noire, the Black Decade. The Algerian leadership during that period was unstable. Benjedid resigned in 1992 and was followed by Mohamed Boudiaf, assassinated that same year. Ali Kefa came next, and Lamine Zeroual was elected president in 1995. A new political party, the RND, was established that same year to give Zeroual legitimacy. The RND would develop to be one of the major Algerian ruling parties. The civil war opposed the government to multiple Islamist factions, including the FIS, but also the GIA, which would come to gain a prominent role in the conflict. The war was bloody, causing between 100,000 and 200,000 deaths, mostly civilians. Horrible events such as the massacre of Rais have left a permanent mark in the Algerian mind. In 1999, President Lamine Zeroual, suspicious about the so-called Algerian deep state, which might or might not have had a role in Boudiaf's assassination, announced he would not finish his presidency, and new elections were organized the same year. In the elections of that same year, 5 candidates withdrew, knowing that the army would skew the elections in favor of the political revenant, Abdelaziz Bouteflika. He became president on April 27, 1999. The FLN, as well as the RND, would form a coalition alongside a moderate Islamist party, the MSP, and support Bouteflika. Bouteflika would go on to stay for 4 terms, and his candidacy for a 5th term in 2019 would prove to be the spark that ignited the Hirak. The beginning of his tenure was marked by a fundamental priority: ending the civil war. For that, he pushed forward a controversial ideology initiated by Zeroual named Concorde Civile. In the spirit of national reconciliation, Bouteflika gave amnesty to many former Islamist fighters, as well as impunity for soldiers who had committed war crimes. The wound was thus semi-closed. The high price of petrol allowed Bouteflika to undertake large infrastructure projects on behalf of the Algerian state, building highways, hospitals, and schools. The message was clear: the state and the army are the sole keepers of peace and development in the country. Bouteflika would go on to rule for 4 successive terms. In 2013, he suffered a stroke, debilitating him and forcing him to use a wheelchair. Since 2014, he barely appeared or spoke in public. When Bouteflika ran for a 5th term in 2019, the Algerian population had enough of this ghostly president, as well as the corrupt and inefficient system he came to represent. However, concluding that the Hirak is solely due to Bouteflika's run for a 5th term would be simplistic. The Hirak is a movement stemming from years of ideological, political, and social change, which we will explore now. Ideological first. Since independence in 1962, the Algerian leadership under the umbrella of the FLN has gained its legitimacy in the anti-colonial independence struggle they led. As the years went by, however, Algerians started to question the singular historic narrative that the FLN had pushed upon them. As historians and students started searching, other versions of Algerian nationalism started to emerge from the past. From Farhad Abbas' ideas on republicanism to Lakhdar Bourega, a former FLN chief who had opposed Boumedienne's military-style rule. This new popular interrogation about what Algerian nationalism really is has contributed to the rise of the slow delegitimization of the Bouteflika FLN system and subsequently the Hirak. Economically, the country has been suffering due to corruption and a drop in oil prices, which decreased government subsidies for infrastructure projects, leading to the loss of 275,000 jobs. The national unemployment average is around 19%, but can reach up to 50% in some rural areas. The lack of hope, dynamism, and stagnation of the Algerian economy has led thousands of young Algerians, often referred to as Haraga, to cross the Mediterranean in search of opportunities in Europe. Historian Benjamin Stora, whose work greatly inspired this episode, also talks about the cultural emptiness and boredom many young Algerians feel, compounded with the realization that their government is out of touch, unreachable. Socially, there has been a rising consensus and general frustration amongst all walks of life, especially the middle class. In 2011, teachers went on strike, then again in 2015. In 2018, doctors went on strike. In the 2019 Hirak movement, lawyers have sided with the protesters. This progressive rise-up of the middle class and its active participation in the movement is similar to the situation in Sudan, during which the SPA was instrumental in the fall of dictator Omar al-Bashir and its replacement with a half-civilian, half-military transitional government. The Hirak movement is unlike any other. For almost 60 Fridays in a row, hundreds of thousands of people marched peacefully through the streets of Algerian cities. The protests are horizontal, leaderless, and include people from all walks of life and different ethnicities. This has its importance as the Berber community of Algeria, originating in the Kabylie region, has often had problems assimilating itself into the FLN's Algeria. The protests have been peaceful and the police response has not been overtly violent, not even close to the violence demonstrated by the Chilean police in the protests that rocked the South American country last year. The movement is also widely peaceful in part because Algerians do not want to relive the terrible civil war of the 1990s. So what has the Hirak achieved? Well, first and foremost, Abdelaziz Bouteflika renounced running for a fifth term, demonstrating the power and influence of the movement. Many of his allies, as well as powerful businessmen, fell with him, including his brother, who is now in jail. However, the fight is far from over. Protesters are asking for a full overhaul of the system to get rid of the entire ruling class they are governed by. They are asking for freedom, democracy, independence between justice and government, and the liberation of political prisoners, amongst other things. For a full list of the movement's demands, check out their February 22nd manifesto, linked in the bio. One major obstacle to the movement is the army, which has huge powers behind the scenes of the Algerian leadership. While at the beginning of the movement, the army and its chief Ahmed Gaid Salah contributed to the fall of Bouteflika, and it has been reluctant to hand over any power to civilian rule. In December, however, Gaid Salah died of a heart attack. Since then, some observers say that the repression has gotten worse. Journalists and Hirak activists are getting arrested more regularly. The army seems to have the upper hand on the Hirak, but things could definitely change in upcoming years. In December 2019, Algerians were called to the polls to elect a new president. The elections were far from what the protesters wanted. Voters had the choice between 5 pro-government candidates. Abdelmajid Tebboune, a former Bouteflika prime minister and campaign manager, was elected. However, only 39.9% of registered voters showed up to vote, with most Algerians calling the elections a scam. Tebboune has tried to ease tensions by freeing political prisoners, but freedom of the press is still limited, and Tebboune's gestures do not satisfy the majority of the protesters who want the whole system, le pouvoir, to come down. COVID has deprived protesters of their main tool: large, long, consistent, and peaceful protests throughout Algeria. The movement isn't dead. Protesters have tried to take the movement to social media, but in a time where governments feel justified to take repressive measures in the light of public health, a pro-democracy movement is having trouble pushing through. Even though some small protests have restarted in multiple cities, demonstrations in front of the police stations to protest the arrest of Hirak leaders have taken place. The government has also started to crack down. According to human rights groups, 60 people are behind bars for Hirak-related offenses, with many of them being social media posts. The next few months will be crucial. It is hard to predict how the movement will develop as political factions are starting to show within the protesters. The situation should be monitored closely, and the actions of the Tebboune government will be more scrutinized than ever by the diplomatic community once countries have dealt with the COVID crisis.
Thank you to Adlen Mohamedi, a geopolitical researcher whose work I will link down below, for helping us get the facts right for this episode. Thank you also to Benjamin Stora, whose book Retour d'Histoire greatly helped us in preparing this episode. See you next time.